Hi, I'm Tom on a budget and welcome to this in-depth review of what I consider to be a fantastic motorcycle to take into Australia and explore the Outback. Some might even go as far as to say that this is the perfect choice to take around the world, the Honda CB500x. This is a 2016 model that I have owned for most of its existence, and it now sits at 60,000 kilometers. Over my time that I have owned it, I have done my own maintenance, and I've also added a whole bunch of modifications to turn the CityBike into what is now a very competent tourer for the Australian Outback. In this review, I want to touch on this motorcycle's suitability for long-distance overland travel, the modifications associated with that, including how to get a better than the 19-inch front wheel you find on the newer variants of this. I'll also go into its reliability, maintainability and the associated cost of all of that, since I do call myself Tom on a budget.
The series was first released in 2013 when Honda brought out their completely new 500 twin platform to replace the CB500, which had been off the market for a few years by then. Their timing actually worked out really well for Honda, as they could design a whole new platform and engine to nail the European A2 license, which came out in the same year. And ever since Ewan McGregor's Long Way Round started that whole adventure bike craze, Honda took the opportunity to take that niche and provide an adventure style bike in that category. They essentially took the frame of the F, fitted taller suspension, a full fairing and an option for a center stand. The end result is a motorcycle equivalent of a Subaru Outback, nothing that'll blow your socks off and nothing that excels in anything really. It's capable enough on gravel roads and tracks with an easy to medium difficulty rating. It's refined and economical enough to make it a usable commuter and tourer, and it's comfortable enough for long road trips. And all of that at a surprisingly affordable price as well. The 2016 to 2018 year models, they kind of sit in the middle of the evolution of this bike series. They received a bit of a facelift compared to the original, bringing in some revised aerodynamics with a taller windscreen, wind deflectors and some other minor refinements as well. The biggest one may be the LED headlight, which will last forever, although I'm questioning whether it's actually brighter than the halogen that it replaces. For the later models from 2019 onwards, Honda carefully listened to the feedback from reviewers and from magazines and brought in a few improvements like the 19-inch front wheel, built-in gear indicator, upside-down shocks, an optional 12-volt outlet, a revised exhaust and some other modifications. I will have to say though, while some of these updates have been welcomed a lot and resulted in increased sales, unfortunately they also improved the MSRP, making the older bike still an appealing option if you are a bit tight on money.
The power plant is a 400-something cc twin-cylinder road bike multi-purpose engine. It produces the A2 specific 47 horsepower, which is about 2 horsepower more than the first car you used to drive. It's, Polish people would know it, more than double that of the Fiat 126P, which my mum, like many others, has used to haul me and my siblings around to school and to go to the shops. If you actually use the power properly and you are light enough, this will get you from 0 to 100 in low 5 seconds. Engine vibrations have, in my opinion, a bit of an impact on your comfort levels, especially if you're doing longer distances or if you're kind of touring around at high speeds. And these are remarkably smooth for a twin cylinder. However, these are known to hit a bit of a resonance at about 5,500 RPM or about 100 kilometers an hour in 6th gear or 60 miles an hour in 6th gear. And you don't feel it much through those nice rubbery footpegs or the well-weighted handlebars above, especially if you're wearing gloves, which you always should. But people who fit crash bars, like I've got these ones on here, they tend to complain about the crash bars ringing and feeling it in some places. But just to put a bit of attention onto that, besides being a bit irritating, that frequency is about 90 Hertz based on the revolutions, which are quite nasty on certain accessories you can fit, especially electronics, as they can just develop cracks and break. Power delivery of this is how I'd imagine maybe a very polite and patient servant. It just delivers without bucking or complaining, it just goes, which makes it really suitable for technical riding like on trails or if you're going in city traffic. It doesn't buck or any nonsense like this. It also has an almost perfectly flat torque curve once you're above 2,500 RPM, which makes it very easy to ride if you go a bit more spirited. However, it does go a little bit against it to some extent. Some might find it maybe a bit boring. I like it this way, but a lot of riders also forget to downshift because it does still pull with decent enough power. If you overtake and do downshift to 7,000 RPM, it'll go overtaking trucks from doing 80 to 130. A problem you also have with that is the power only starts to drop off just before you hit the rev limiter. So if you do go a bit more spirited, you might actually kind of get a bit of a surprise when it does cut out on you at the rev limiter. Over the decade that these bikes have been in production, they have gotten a reputation of reliability. And in my opinion, they also have the same trait in common with Toyotas, that you can usually limp them back home if something does break. There have been even a few reports of bikes that have already exceeded well over 100,000 kilometers with just standard maintenance. They don't burn any oil, unlike some single cylinders like the KLR 650. They've got a huge sump, which gives you a huge margin of error, and even the electronics come to help a little bit, with the check engine light coming on if you are running low on oil, and the oil pressure light warning you in the unlikely scenario that you have run out of oil. If there was ever going to be anything to kill these engines, it's possibly going to be the cooling system. There have been a very few isolated reports of leaky water pumps. I've once found my very small reservoir to be low on fluid after a long ride at 45 degrees in the desert, so that's something you want to keep an eye on. More likely, what would kill them is if you were to take a rock and hit it into the radiator. It's normally pretty well protected by the longish guard on here, but these are only $30 and these might be kind of good piece of insurance. Something that if you do your own maintenance, you want to keep in mind is these do run blue coolant, which is silicate free. You can read it up in the manual. From what I've read, the green stuff contains silicates and can damage your water pumps, which might cause you a bit of grief later on in life. An actual design flaw on this motorbike is actually this engine bolt on here. There have been a few examples of people finding them to be severely bashed up and or snapped. I have snapped 2 of these. It's more common amongst people who install crash bars, which you really want to protect those nice plastics, and also who fit that rally raid bash plate that mounts onto here, unlike some that mount onto soft aluminium components. The problem with that is simply that big stack of components where you have to put a bolt through and then mount into that engine in here into drilled and tapped hole. The solution to that is you're just very brave. You just get a 10mm drill bit and you just drill out the threads, get a much longer bolt, and then you tighten it down on that bolt on here. We've gotten that much nicer leverage. It doesn't jam up. And ever since then, or ever since I've approached it this way, I've never had any issues. And if it does break, you just put a new bolt on here because it all just falls out rather than having to deal with a broken stub. In terms of repair costs and maintainability, it's a bit of an oddball experience. It can be done on the cheap, but it's kind of like running Linux for free if you don't value your time. Some of the items are very maintainable and very easy to work on. The tires are really easy to access, and if you do puncture them, at least the rear in my example is tubeless, so it's just a 5-minute plug job. I've never had a puncture on this. The intervals are quite long as well, and rarely does something go wrong on it. It's easy enough to check your oil level, which you should be kind of doing regularly, although this bike just doesn't burn any oil because it's a nice modern twin with that spyglass on here, which every bike should have. The air filter, which is in here, is something you want to check if you do flood it in a river crossing that's gone wrong, and that's at least sort of approachable. It just sits under the seat, unlike on the Honda Transalp, which carries that air filter under the tank, and that is criminal in my opinion for an adventure motorcycle. What this motorbike, however, does carry under the tank is all of the access to the top of the head, which also unfortunately includes access to the spark plugs. So if you do find a lot of water in your air intake, well, now you have to take the spark plugs out and you are going to be in a world of hurt to get those. You also have to get to there every 24,000 kilometers to replace the spark plugs and to do your big service, which can be very expensive if you get it done by a dealership. In my instance, it was $1,000 Australian for doing that, plus chain replacement at that service interval. Even unfortunately, the oil change isn't spared from being a little bit more annoying than it would like to be, because that plug has got a bit of an odd design standing out in the back. That means you have to remove your skid plate if you're running the one from Rally Raid. It also means you have a bit of a complication to get to the oil filter. At least, as I said, the oil filtration is really good on this. I do run a gold plug on it, and like it almost collects no shavings. So it's kind of cheap and really long lasting a motorbike. It's just not as easy to work on. With the weight, I can't even blame the frame. To me, a biggest culprit is possibly the engine. It's a straight up design, unlike the NC750 or a Boxer that kind of carries the weight a bit lower down. That's also made worse by having a very modern sports bike tall sump. Superfast Matt complained about this as being a very common thing with a lot of sports bikes nowadays to do that. That lifts that whole hump of metal really high up in the frame, which you now have to carry. The next item of that is then the fuel fuel tank. The NC700 and my Wave and some German adventure bikes, they carry the fuel tank under the seat, which really drops the center of gravity. In here, you've got that 17-liter fuel tank plus steel construction, so it's more than 17 kilograms, all the way up here, lifting up all of your center of gravity, making this a bit more challenging to handle. And that's unfortunately a common scenario with all modern Japanese sports bikes, including the T7 and the Africa Twin, which are even heavier than this.
It's not really a problem if you're moving at normal speeds and you've got good grip below you. It kind of behaves like an inverted pendulum that you just maneuver with the tires below you. However, it does become a problem whenever the bike starts to go sideways on you without any grip or momentum. So there are things like going through very slippery creek crossings with no speed, or when you're going over very uneven surfaces, or just simply if you misjudged a rut and you come to an abrupt stop and you have to catch it with your feet. And now that you have to deal with the equivalent of an anvil sitting on the top of your fuel tank, very frequently what you see happen is that once the bike goes beyond a certain angle, people just drop them because they just can't hold that heavy weight. And once it does end up on the floor, you have to deadlift a lot more motorcycle than if the weight was closer to the wheels. You also have the problem that the 500X is quite skinny, so it does fall really flat and quite low to the ground.
This motorcycle taught me a lot about tires, and particularly about the shape. This came originally with Dunlop 609 Trail Max tires, which have got a very steep V shape to them, and that causes the bike to fall into corners. I always been told like, oh, it's the geometry, it's the rake angle. No, the tire makes a big difference too. Where it was so extreme that if you go around the corner, the whole bike would just kind of fall in, and you had to counter it to stop it from falling any further. Anything after that is a lot more neutral. I have upgraded since then a few times to different tires. At one point I ran Shinko 705s in the original size in the front and in the rear. They're good enough, they're fine. They certainly handled on dirt a lot better than the Dunlops. The Dunlops, because of their weird design, they would cause the bike to flip-flop left and right. They just worked fine. The Shinkos, one thing to remember with them is, or maybe two, is once they start to go past 50% of their tread, they start to wear a lot faster, which was a bit of a surprise to me. So if you go on a big trip, just beware, the tire will wear faster than you think. And the second one as well is they can be a bit sensitive to running at low pressures with high weight and speed. They can start to delaminate. That's a problem you see more with bigger motorcycles. The 500 is not so much affected by this, and depends on how fast you go. The fronts can last forever if you run the Shinkos. However, I'm running different tires now to some extent. In the back, I'm running the Motor Structionator GPS, which behaves pretty much the same. Is nothing spectacularly different, but they do last longer with that thick band. Not much to say. They're actually a good budget choice because of their longevity compared to the Shinkos. In the front, I am running a bit of a party trick, which is the 709 in the size 120 by 90. That means 120 millimeters wide with a 90% height ratio. Originally come with a 70% ratio, which is a lot smaller. That gives me essentially the same outer diameter as if I had a 19-inch front wheel. And that's essentially kind of a trick that four-wheel drivers use. I don't know why motorbikers don't talk about it a bit more honestly, where four-wheel drivers only talk about the outer diameter of a tire. And what that gives you is more sidewall to play with. And that sidewall has two advantages. One of them is if I do hit an obstacle at speed, I've got a lot more of a buffer zone before I damage the rim or before I hit the rim. I also can play a lot more with my tire pressures. If I do let them down, I can let them down a lot more and have a bit more flex from the tire, and this can give me a bigger area, and the bike can float much nicer on soft surfaces like sand. This can do sand quite well. I'm just not as strong as I should be to kind of take it to some places. Maybe I need to get something a bit lighter. For the weight that it has, it can do it quite well. A lot of people like to complain that this has got cast wheels and oh my god, aren't they going to shatter as soon as you just look at a pothole? Putting that worry to rest, I have taken this on roads where I've been doing 100 kilometers an hour, hitting cattle grids with a step this high and boulders that are about this big while running low tire pressures. And all that happened is I have dented up the rim. It's the same kind of damage that I would have had as well as if I had spoked rims as well. If you look up images on the internet, you find plenty of dinged up spoke rims too, especially on BMWs. I think BMW is very soft aluminium. And here comes now one of the big advantages. I've only damaged one of them that I have replaced, and a replacement rim is only $300. Yes, it's expensive compared to a car, but on a motorcycle, if you compare that with Rally Raid's offering for spoked wheels, they cost you $2,000 for a set, for a rear and a front, plus $300 in shipping to Australia. I can get 7 of these here for the set, and what do you think am I going to destroy earlier? Also, these don't require any maintenance. They're solid and that's it. Spoke rims, you have to keep checking them because they start to ping at some point, and you then have to start replacing the spokes, and you have to make sure you tighten them right because otherwise you break them again and they just take more effort. Another big advantage as well is, and I've got that here in the back on my motos, is I am running tubeless on here. If you do puncture it, it's just a 5-minute job to fit a puncture plug and you can keep going. Just reinflate it again. You don't have to remove the wheel and muck around with tubes. On this Shinko tire, I do have tubes, unfortunately, but that's because of the size. They only come officially to fit it legally as a front tire. They only come in a tube type variant. At least it's a universal tire, so I should never ever puncture this one here. Front tires puncture in general quite rarely. A common complaint with this motorbike is the suspension. It's also something where I find like it's good enough. It's fine. I like it. It's softish, which is okay on most dirt roads. Yeah, it gets a little bit upset if you go over corrugations. Maybe the one thing that I would like to maybe improve is on the rear, is that it doesn't have any rebound dampening, so that if you go over a speed bump, the back just kind of ejects up into the sky, and that makes it a little bit less nice to ride. But in a way, it's good in my opinion that it does not like to go as fast, because it just keeps my speed in check. When I'm going on these roads in the middle of nowhere, sometimes it's better that I don't kind of hurt myself. Moving on to mods finally, and I've modified this motorbike quite extensively, similar to my Honda Wave, although here I had to do maybe some more important modifications to make this more suitable off the pavement. The most important mod, unfortunately, with the CB500X is the skid plate. This needs a very good one because of that very low belly pan, especially the older models before they lifted it with the taller front wheel. I have been fortunate that it came with the Rally Raid unit, and I could almost not speak more highly of it, apart from it making maintenance a bit more painful and losing the ability to fit a center stand. It is a mild steel construction, which means that if you do hit it, and you will, every time I come back from a trip, you can just bang it back into place. And I've done it so many times now that I just stripped back all the paint and just replaced it with black paint from the hardware store. Staying with the scheme of protection, I've got these crash bars as well and those spark busters. It's just to protect the bike in a tip over, just to stop plastics from being damaged and levers from being broken. These also have like the nice little side effect that they are kind of like great to put your feet on if you are riding long distances, just to kind of rest yourselves a little bit on those long highway rides. The first mod I do to any motorbike and actually vehicle is I fit a phone mount, because phones make a great navigation device and you can get maps for off-road and anything you want. I'm running the ram mount quick grip with the clamp for handlebars, and I've got a couple of reasons for that. It's single-handed operation. It's really quick to kind of put it on, take it off. You don't have to fiddle around like with the quad lock, and it's very secure. Don't bother with the cheapies, they just fall apart. The second modification I do to any motorbike is installing something that lets me charge my phone, and on the 500X I've been sticking to these dumb outlets now for a couple of reasons. The first one is I can use my 12-volt compressor, so I can reinflate my tires after I've come off a gravel road, off sand or anything like that, or if I had a puncture. I've never had one on this bike, luckily. The other reason is unfortunately a bit more sinister. The vibrations of the engine are prone to destroying any electrics that you hard mount, and the 12-volt USB chargers are one of the ones that do tend to break. In this instance, if I do break one, I just run to the nearest petrol station, buy a new one. Here I've been running a bit of a nicer one to charge my drone as well. Speaking of electrics, that gets me onto how to power them. The lazy man solution is to wire everything straight to the battery, and you see that done very commonly. The problem is it just is very error prone. If you hit the grips on and there's some fault with them, they just don't detect something, you drain your battery. You plug in a USB charger, keep it plugged in, you forget about it, you drain your battery, and then you have to push start it. I've been running everything through a relay where if you turn on ignition, that comes on and these come on, and if I turn it off, everything everything is switched off. Which leads me on to the wiring of the relay. I unfortunately didn't know any better, and I have wired it into the switchgear in here and just leached off the wires, and I've got a 3 relay set to trigger everything. Honda have actually been quite nice, except that they've just hidden it and provided an accessory plug under the fairings in here, which has got one output for ignition on and the second output for spotlights. That high beam on this bike is not very good in my opinion. It's a nice LED, but it's just not very bright and not very widespread. And I am somebody who, against all recommendations, does ride at nighttime. So I installed spotlights. I've been running 4 of these 10 watt TMH eBay bulbs or eBay lights that I have fitted using, I think these are hose clamps from Bunnings, onto my crash bars. And you could fit 20 watt lights that are a bit wider. The problem we run into, and you see a lot of people who have them, is as soon as you go any wider, you are outside of these fairings, and if you do tip over, you could hit your fairings and damage the plastics. When you're doing over 1,000 kilometers a day, something I've learned to really appreciate is decent wind protection. At least in my experience, against all reviews of the 2016 500X, is that the OEM windscreen is just dreadful. I'm 180 centimeters, 1.80 m or 71 inches for Americans. And in my instance, the OEM screen would just amplify all wind straight into my face. It was so bad that I had to close the visor in parking lots, and at highway speeds, if I didn't duck down, my vision would get blurry. It was this bad. A cheap solution you can find is just adding an aftermarket wind spoiler on the top of the OEM screen, which works wonderful. I have gone with that Puig touring screen with a mild dark tint, which I think kind of like looks quite nice, and it really improves the situation. I also went with the one with that thin spoiler on top, just to give me a bit of a better chance. It works mostly well, but with my bigger helmet I do still get a bit of buffeting, and you could just fit a wider one like I have on my Wave to improve that a bit. Moving just behind the windscreen, this is where I carry my sunglasses. It's very easy to just mount a phone on here or a GPS, which I used to have. However, this bar gets a lot of the vibrations from the engine. To the left of this is where I carry my PLB, and it's a device I highly recommend to anybody who goes into remote areas. And I prefer a PLB like this one here over something like a Garmin InReach for 3 reasons. Number 1 is the subscription fee. If on your Garmin, if you run out of your subscription, nobody's going to help. Same with a Spot. There's no fee. Number 2 is the battery. You can only use it for emergencies. It's an expensive fine if you do use them wrongfully. And you will not deplete the battery by just sending breadcrumbs or sending, hey, I'm fine messages, just to find out, oh, I didn't recharge this, and now that you had an accident or you need help, it's out of juice. That battery is valid for 10 years if you buy one. And the third one is just the range. These have got a much bigger antenna and a much better ability to penetrate cloud cover, canopies and trees, and much faster than a Garmin InReach or Spot. I might just as well mention quickly the dashboard. It doesn't have a gear indicator, which is very unfortunate. I wish all motorbikes had a gear indicator. You can get one aftermarket from eBay that just kind of glues onto here with silicone, and it plugs into the plug under the seat. A cool thing is you have got 2 trips on your motorbike that you can set to get the distance since the trip, but also how much fuel you have used and what your fuel economy has been. That is very, very useful if you need to know your fuel range when you're in the Outback. So if you've got jerry cans in the back and you know how much fuel you've got in total, 17 liters in this tank, then you can estimate your total range and how far you can make it, or to what fuel stop you can make it as you're touring. Just be very careful though, if you reach the reserve part of your fuel tank, it will reset that trip, which is very frustrating. I wish Honda didn't do that. Moving back to the wheels for a second there, if you permit me, is the front fender. I lifted this one because of the much taller front tires. I've used these carbon fiber strips that I have cut into the right shape. It's actually quite easy to work with, but you have to wear a mask if you do cut at stuff. It's not very good for your lungs. Going a bit further back is this little extension. Since I am running the taller tire, there is more risk of stuff being flung up, and this really helps a little bit with reducing stuff being flung onto the radiator, into the engine, and water being sprayed onto your feet in the rain. A modification this has got in common with my Honda Wave is that kickstand, which I had to lengthen. I've lengthened it by welding on this extension onto the foot, just by leaning it onto the ground at the right length and just to start welding on. It really needs that because already from Honda, that stand is quite short and causes the bike to lean over quite a lot, which makes it very prone for you to just drop it if you have to move it from the other side and you drop it down and you don't notice that the stand isn't down. I also had to lift it because of that taller front wheel. Since I was at it, I also added the duck foot to stop it from sinking in on soft surfaces like on grass or sand as well. Going a bit further back, this is the seat. That seat is actually quite comfortable and it doesn't need any modifications. I've put this mesh on here, which is a very common modification on small motorcycles in Southeast Asia. It doesn't need it. The seat is very comfortable. I just put it on here because I just protect that surface of the seat with from my shoes and from my luggage that I tend to put on in the back. Now that we're in the back, let's talk about the rack. And this here is following Austin Vince's formula for luggage, which is a lockable top box for convenience and security. So I've got my valuables in here out of the way for sticky fingers, and I can get to it very quickly. And on here, I've got soft luggage so that if I do fall over, I don't hurt my feet. And this kind of like taught me a lot of frustrations with commercial luggage rack offerings, which unfortunately for the 500X are not very good, which is why I've made my own. This is made out of old lounge chairs and has had a couple of requirements. One of them was that it has to be narrow. So if you look at it, you can't go any narrower than this. And that is just so that my luggage can stay in line of my handlebars and my mirrors, so that if I filter through traffic, if I fit through, I don't hit in the rear. There's a famous gif of a guy who didn't and fell into a boat because of that. Then the next one is the Nelson rig panniers are very tall and they're very likely to touch the exhaust. And yeah, you can be really finicky and do it right, and then one day you make a mistake and you've got a big hole in your panniers. I have put on these stoppers just to stop them from touching on. The stopper is also kind of purposefully designed to be behind the exhaust so that, again, if I do fall, I don't hurt my feet as well. The other side as well has also got a stopper just to kind of keep it in line, but that stopper is designed to kind of like fold up, which brings me on to the construction of this. Welding stuff is really difficult. A lot of racks that you do find are usually just like flat steel, which kind of like can cut like a knife and it doesn't look very pretty. This is made out of a lounge chair or out of chairs to make it a little bit nicer and is easy to work with as well. And if you use equipment like this, you also get these pre-bent pieces already for free at nice 90-degree angles. Welding this metal is already hard enough. Don't make your life more difficult by having to bend it as well. The next rack on top of that is this one here, which is an actual genuine Givi rack for that top box. And for some reason, you can still see a bit of that sticker through the paint that I've put on just because I was lazy. And it says on here, maximum 6 kilograms. It's a flipping joke. It's very upsetting. And unfortunately, you have to stick within that limit because these bars are so long, they will just bend down, as this top box here, which is a wonderful box, weighs 5 kilograms. So if you go on any rough roads, this whole thing will bend down. I had to bend it up a couple times until at some point I had enough of this nonsense and I welded on these cross beams on to the rack. So now all the forces travel from here nicely through a triangulation to the foot pegs, which are strong enough to hold the passenger in the back. The top box is something I've been really happy with. It's a Givi Tracker Outback and they unfortunately are quite expensive, so I've been very happy that I managed to get it second-hand with the bike. And it's a great design by being square, which allows you to easily organize your luggage on the inside, especially if you've got very flat stuff like a laptop that you can just lock away on the inside quite easily. It also lends itself like in other ways as well, that kind of layout, by allowing you to mount stuff in front of it. So I tend to usually carry my tent in front, and you can also put stuff on top. I usually carry my sleeping roll. As you can see, this has got a bit of a reflective surface or nicely polished surface at the top from my sleeping mat that you can then tie down with these tie downs on here. These handles also, they're actually quite useful, not only for kind of carrying it around when you kind of want to go use it for shopping or some odd reason, or take it into a hotel. It also is really great for just maneuvering the bike. So makes it just a bit easier since you don't have a very good rack to hold onto here. It also helps out with picking it up, which is why this bar is a little bit bent. since I dropped this motorbike a couple times, and this has been just a good place to help me pick it up. Since I have mentioned the mat that sits on here, you do want to carry your weight as low as possible. The mat I've got is just very light foam, but the heaviest stuff you unfortunately need to carry if you go into the Outback are tools. And for that I've made this tool tube. It's a very common Australian mod where you just take 100mm sewage pipe, and this has got a couple of advantages. A, it's really strong PVC and it doesn't weigh that much, and it's really easy to work with. This is where I usually carry my spanners, my tire plug kit, straps and some other stuff inside as well. They're also waterproof, and sewage pipe usually is. I mean, when was the last time you smelled poo-poo inside of your living room? They also are very easy to kind of get mounted. You just get these clamps in your hardware store and you just bend them to the right shape. I usually also have a cable tie just to mount it on here, which also kind of breaks if the bike falls on me. This is a nice round shape, so it doesn't hurt my foot as well. To get this nice black paint, what you have to do is you have to primer them with special plastic primer, and then you can paint them up. Otherwise the paint will not stick.
So, what is it like to ride? Well, the word that comes to mind is Honda. If you've come off a thumper or an older motorbike like a Suzuki GS500 or an old CB250, this immediately feels much more refined with its light controls, a smooth engine, very comfortable seat and nice wind protection too. Which are all characteristics you want to see in a everyday or multi-purpose motorbike, kind of like an SUV. I live close to the city of Brisbane and a motorbike is my main mode of transport, so I commute almost daily through residential areas. And in this environment, it's quite alright. You could choose far worse. You could have a race bike with some crazy race tune that just bogs down as soon as you come to a stoplight. It can be ridden quite smoothly with its light clutch, nicely spaced gearbox, and it's also very stable, which makes filtering a bit easy, although the wide handlebars and the mirrors, they do restrict you a little bit with tight gaps. For me, however, it does feel a little bit overkill and a bit more cumbersome than any of the 125cc bikes that I have owned and ridden so far in the past. However, where it's really at home is the open road. It just feels kind of like a train or a passenger airliner, where my wave feels a bit like a housefly. It just zips around, it gets blown around a little bit more. This just feels like it's going on tracks. It's a very comfortable bike to do long distances, and I've done multiple 1000 plus kilometer days on it. It loves to sit at just under 100 kilometers an hour. It'll also happily tour at 130 k's an hour as well, but the wind noise and the engine screaming, they kind of make it a bit tiresome to ride. Also, your fuel economy goes up quite a bit as well. And how much better is the fuel economy? Well, so when I'm touring at those slower speeds, I get about 3.5 liters to 100, and that should give you about 480 kilometers out of a tank, which is very useful in an area where petrol stations are quite far spread. Not to mention the cost savings you've got with the current fuel prices. A more important factor may actually be just wildlife, because we do have the odd kangaroo and emu that like to jump out and kill themselves, and you in the process too. And that's where the slower speeds are kind of more welcoming, and they also help you with stopping distance. And speaking of stopping distance, that single rotor is more than strong enough to stop you reliably. I actually don't see any reason why you would need two. I actually prefer it over the twin discs you've got on the newer bikes, simply because it's easy to maintain and you've got half the pistons and brake pads to worry about. And this is also helped by that ABS system, which works well enough on dirt too. You can watch the video by MAD or Motorcycle Adventure Dirt Bike TV when they did the Simpson Desert crossing. I certainly never felt the need to switch it off on dirt. And dirt is one of the reasons why we buy adventure bikes or these SUVs on two wheels. This will happily do Outback highways and even do tracks with an easy to medium difficulty rating. It starts to struggle on difficult tracks, you can push it, but it can get a bit hairy. Something that actually helps you, and not many people talk about it, is that twin-cylinder engine. Because of its smoother power output, it actually gives you better traction on hill climbs and in sand. And that's not just me saying it, that's John Mitchinson, and I've got a lot of respect for this man. What in my opinion also adds to that is that low first gear and nicely spaced gearbox, which lets you kind of traction through some tighter spots without having to use the clutch excessively either. Something that surprised me was that I found it easier to position the front wheel than on a CRF 300 Rally when I rode those two bikes side by side, although the Rally is a lot lighter, which kind of makes it a bit easier in really hairy stuff. What really holds me back for the most part are its low clearance and its high weight, or how high up the weight is. Sure, some off-road god like Chris Birch who will wheelie and stoppie this thing through the entire Glasshouse Mountains. For me, it's just a little bit too much, at least for my skill level. And this is just where we have to be honest with our skill levels. I have managed to accept that I have not started riding motorbikes before I started walking, and I don't pretend to be part of the Think Desert Race or the Dakar Rally, where they usually have got medics and rescue helicopters on standby. I am usually all alone, with a heavily loaded bike, with camping gear, unescorted, 600 kilometers from the nearest hospital, so I just take in the environment and just take it easy. All to finish off on where you might take it on the weekends, and those are usually the twisties. I live near Northbrook Parkway or the Mount Glorious and Mount Nebo Loop, which has got some great corners. While the steering is slowed down a lot, the geometry of the bike gives you a really good feel for the tire's position, making it a very precise ride. And if you get high up in the rev range, especially in lower gears, that thing will book it. It will go pretty quickly, and I can't see myself being able to use more performance on a public road. Which brings me to the question, how could I make it any better for all of these scenarios that I do use it for occasionally, especially since I'm on the fence on whether I want to keep it while I'm on my big trip next year. One idea that I have been contemplating is joining the dark side by fitting a car tire, and that is for two reasons. One of them is cost, because a car tire would last a lot longer. You can watch Ryan F9's video on it, and also to give it better flotation on soft surfaces like sand. The biggest complaints I've got with that bike, or the series in general, are the items that Honda would have to rectify, and I just don't see them or any Japanese manufacturer address with their adventure bikes. They all seem to be going backwards. The biggest item being the high center of mass. I was very hopeful when rumors came out about a Honda Transalp, because Honda had such a good platform to work off with the NC series, which has got the engine tilted forward, a shallower sump, and a fuel tank under the seat. They've then replaced the fuel tank with a lockable storage box for extra convenience, which you could even fit a full-size helmet inside. The valve adjustment was also easier on that motorbike because you could get to the valves without having to strip half a damn motorcycle, and if the valves ever got out of spec, they were just a simple screw type adjustment, not shims which you have to muck around with. Which makes me think that maybe I do sell the 500 and get an NC700 instead. I don't know. A bit of an Achilles heel that both bikes have in common are the sensitive footpegs. Some people, they whinge about that they are too soft or too skinny. Look, I don't mind them, and they have never stopped me from going to places. The problem with them is how easy they break. I've broken 2 of them so far, and my partner has broken 1 on her Grom, and they are a real bum to order, even though Honda used the same ones on half of their lineup. I just don't understand why they don't keep any stock. At least if you do break them, check out Wreckers, because likely they have them as well. And I can hear you type on the keyboard. You can replace them with stronger ones. The problem is, these pegs, they do act as a mechanical fuse that protects the much more expensive mounting plates. So if I now break something, I will break the much more expensive component that I can't replace as easily. Maybe the solution is to carry a couple spares. Now to ask the ancient question, is this bike the best bike to take around the world? Because I've seen it said a couple times. Maybe you can drop a comment and tell me what you think is the best bike to take around the world. In my opinion, it's a very solid choice, but it all depends on your physique, where you want to go, and your expectations. And speaking of physique, since the 500X does appear on a lot of lists of short rider-friendly motorbikes, and I cannot agree with them at all. My partner, she is 5'2" or about 158 centimeters, and even before I lifted the front wheel, she wasn't able to touch the ground with her feet, which of course is made worse by its top-heavy nature. So if you don't have a lot of upper body strength or very good balance, you really might want to look elsewhere. But if you do fit on it, it's possibly one of the most dependable motorcycles you can buy today to take around the globe. Because not much breaks on these. Yes, you can break a footpeg, but you can still ride it with a broken footpeg. I rode mine all the way from Fraser Island back to Brisbane with a broken footpeg. You can still limp them out. And this is of course helped by the 500X being a world bike, meaning that Honda sell them in pretty much every market where they sell bikes. Compare that with the favorite of best around the world bike lists like the Cold War era DR650 or the KLR 650. And these are absolute darlings of America and of the Australian Outback. Even I was considering buying one of these bikes. But you might struggle if you go into Europe. And that's simply because they haven't been sold there for decades due to emissions. And I've seen a few posts of people struggling to find parts for them. And this is simply not as bad of the CB500X. Sure, okay, I will say they can take some truly astronomical time spans to deliver some parts. I've once been told that I would have to wait 10 weeks for a simple bolt to get it delivered from Japan. But at least you do have the option of being able to go to Wrecker because they are quite popular. And so you might ask me, Tom, are you going to take yours around the world? Well, I do think it's a solid choice for the Australian Outback, but I have made my mind up and I'm going to take my Wave. And that is for a couple of reasons. Sure, this bike will do a much better job on fast highways, especially in Western countries, but you know what also does a much better job on fast highways than my Wave? A bus, a train, a plane, or a car. And at the end of it, I just like to get into the thick of it and have an adventure and have a fun time. And this is simply where the 500X has let me down a few times in the past. I genuinely do worry that I might get stranded with this bike in a remote location simply because I drop it in a slippery location and I can't pick it back up again. Which can be remedied simply by taking slightly less adventurous paths, but there's still that worry that I might just drop it in something benign like a low-level crossing that's just covered in algae. And compared to my Wave, it also costs a little bit more to run with its high fuel consumption and its maintenance or part cost. But a part that not many people talk about is shipping. Because the 500X weighs so much more and is physically larger, it's going to cost me a lot more to transport, especially with air cargo. I'll also add the added charm or the underdog factor of arriving on something a bit more adventurous and basic. I do feel like I get more smiles on the humble Wave, but also it's an asset when you're dealing with authorities. The more obvious one being authorities in developing countries, especially those where the word bakshish is a common occurrence. If you arrive on the same motorbike that the wife is using of the border guard you're dealing with, they certainly won't look you as much as a walking bank as if you arrive on something that looks very much like a 1200 GS. But even in Western countries, you tend to get less judgmental looks if you arrive on something where people are surprised that it can do the speed limit over something where you very likely have broken the limit. But it's all to say, it is a Honda. If you do like the 500, go check them out at the dealerships, have a look online for used bikes. If you want to buy one, they're a low-risk option because if you don't like it, you can always sell it. There's always bikes on the market and there's always people to buy them, and they always hold the value really well, since after all, they are Honda. And so I'd like to say thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of this very long video. And hey, this is still a brand new channel, so dropping me a like and a subscription go a very long way, and I hope to see you in the next video.